Hello everybody and welcome to the third video of my breakdown of the iGCSE Biology 9-1 course. This video is going to cover the entirety of the following specification point, the variety of living organisms. Now, this video is tailored for the Dexel iGCSE course and preparing you for its exam. However, if you're studying under another exam board like AQA or Cambridge, you'll probably still find this video useful. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Now, referring back to our previous video, we learned how to determine if something is a living organism or not through checking if it carried out the Mrs. H. Gren processes. Now that we know what living organisms are, we can classify them or sort them into two big groups based on their features: eukaryotic organisms and prokaryotic organisms. Eukaryotic organisms are organisms that can be both multicellular and unicellular. You probably find it useful to break these words into the roots to understand them better. The prefix uni here means one, just like how a unicycle has one wheel, or a unicorn has one horn, and multi refers to multiple. So what they're saying is that eukaryotic organisms can have many cells, or just be one cell. Great. What else? You also need to know that eukaryotic cells contain a nucleus with a distinct membrane, and that is where they store their DNA. Specifically, this nucleus and the rest of the parts that make up the cell are bound by these membranes. The role of the nucleus is explained in much greater detail in my cell structure video, which I recommend you watch, but all you need to know for now is that they have these nuclei. Again, it's not just nuclei either. They contain more membrane-bound organelles such as mitochondria. The key part here is that their organelles are all bound by membranes. The other group here are prokaryotic organisms. They can only be unicellular, and they don't have membrane-bound components, nor do they have a nucleus. This applies to stuff like bacteria. Only one cell, smaller than eukaryotic cells, and no nucleus. These bacteria store their DNA in other ways, which I'll explain later on. Now that we know what living organisms are, and we've got those two key words out of the way, we can actually get to categorizing these organisms. So, how this works is, all living organisms are categorized into one of 5 total groups, and we refer to these groups as kingdoms. Basically, we're just grouping some of these organisms together based on some of the features they have in common, which gives us a much easier time, and stops us from lumping in something like a lion with a sunflower in one broad category of living organism. So, what are these 5 kingdoms? They're plants, animals, fungi, prototists, and bacteria. The first segment of the video here is going to be focused on the kingdoms of eukaryotic organisms, which are plants, animals, fungi, and prototists. All of the organisms in these kingdoms are eukaryotes. Let's break all of these down, starting with animals. Animals are eukaryotic organisms. We're multicellular. We're not just made up of one cell, but made up of many cells. They don't have chloroplasts, and they can't photosynthesize because of it. If you remember from the living organisms video, animals feed through something known as heterotrophic nutrition. We rely on consuming other organisms as our source of nutrition. Animal cells also do not have cell walls on the outside, only cell membranes. Most animals have some kind of nervous coordination as well, meaning they can respond rapidly to changes in the environment around them. Animals will also usually move around from one place to another. And finally, they often store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, a storage molecule made up of many connected glucose molecules, or glucose units or monomers. And if you remember the aerobic respiration equation, we need this glucose to release the energy our body needs. So make sure you know glycogen very well. It's the specific carbohydrate storage molecule in animals. If you're confused on what a carbohydrate is, we discuss it in a later video, but think of them as sugars for now, and you need these sugars to release that energy your body needs. Now, as a part of your specification, you'll also be asked to give some examples of animals or organisms in the animal kingdom. This one is quite easy. Things like mammals and insects, any animal would work here. Moving on now, we have got plants. They are also multicellular organisms. However, unlike animals, they do have chloroplasts, and they can photosynthesize, which is why we consider plants autotrophs. They don't eat other organisms, rather they make their own food using abiotic energy like sunlight. Their cells also have cell walls, and like we said in the cell structure video, it's important that you know that these cell walls are made of a substance named cellulose. You also have to know that plants will store carbohydrates as either sucrose or starch, unlike glycogen in animals. Again, you've got to know some examples of plants. Things like beans, peas, sunflowers, any plants will work for this. Next up are fungi. Some fungi are unicellular, but most, except for a fungus called yeast, are multicellular. Now, we're about to get into some grade 9 level content here, so pay close attention. Let's take a look at the unique structure of a fungus. They have a body called a mycelium, which is made up of hyphae. These are thread-like structures that branch out and spread, often underground like you see in this example. Now, you don't need to know this part, but these hyphae contain a lot of nuclei. Unlike plant or animal cells, which usually only have one nucleus per cell, fungal hyphae grow as long, continuous tubes with many nuclei inside. This allows them to grow quickly and efficiently transport nutrients to the main fungus body. Now, I appreciate that it's a lot of terminology, especially new terminology, but to put it simply, the mycelium is the fungal body, and the hyphae are the tiny threads that make up this mycelium, and the nuclei are there because fungal cells don't divide the way that plant and animal cells do, but they divide differently, so we need a lot of nuclei for that division. Now, it's worth mentioning that while hyphae often spread underground, like in the example, they're not always hidden. Some fungi grow on surfaces, like mold on your bread, or even inside living things as parasites. But this is a great explanation on why you can't just slice off the moldy part of the bread and eat it, because as soon as fungus has infected it, the hyphae are likely to have spread out through the entire loaf, even if not all of them are visible on the surface. And of course, the previous example is a mushroom, which is the fruiting body of a certain fungi, growing above ground, while there's a huge mycelium that we don't see staying down below in the soil. Biology loves throwing these complicated terms at you, but once you break them down, they're not so bad really. Just make sure to remember these keywords, they'll be important for your exam, and a little more on that will be talked about in the past paper section. Anyways, you also need to know that fungi, like plant cells, have cell walls, except instead of a cellulose cell wall, their cell walls are made of a substance named chitin. Also, unlike plants which feed by autotrophic nutrition, and animals which feed by heterotrophic nutrition, fungi feed through something we call sapotrophic nutrition, another very important exam keyword. So what's this sapotrophic nutrition? Sapotrophic nutrition is when a fungus secretes extracellular digestive enzymes into the area outside of the fungal body to dissolve their food, so that they can then absorb the nutrients from that by diffusion. Let's break this down a little simpler. Extracellular enzymes are just enzymes outside of the cell. Extracellular, outside of the cell. Digestive enzymes are enzymes that digest large food molecules into smaller, simpler nutrient molecules that the fungus needs and absorbs. We look into this in a later topic, but these enzymes are proteins that help catalyze or speed up a reaction. In this case, the reaction is a reaction that breaks down or digests these large molecules into small ones. And once they're small enough to be absorbed, they move into the fungal body through a process called diffusion. Diffusion is, again, looked at in the next topic, but it's the movement of substances from an area of high concentration to low concentration. What that means is it's from an area where there's a lot of something to an area where there's little of something, and it moves from the area where there's a lot to the area where there's little of it. In this case, the high concentration is outside of the fungus. All of the food is digested and turned into these small nutrient molecules, and they're all outside of the fungus. So they'll move from that area of a high concentration to an area of the low concentration, which is inside the fungus. And that's how the fungus absorbs all of these nutrients. Pretty interesting. And to wrap it up, just like animals, fungi store carbohydrates as glycogen. Now, in terms of examples of fungi, you have to learn these specific ones. Yeast, a single-celled fungus, as well as mucor, a multicellular fungus with a mycelium and hyphae, like we were looking at before. Finally, for the eukaryotic organisms, we need to take a look at protoctists. So these are unicellular or simple multicellular organisms, and they're very tiny. They're considered microscopic, which means that you need to use a microscope to see them. Now, their structure is a little strange. Some of them have got features making them more like animal cells and feed on other organic matters, just like us animals do, while others have features that are similar to plant cells, as some of those protoctists can have chloroplasts, cell walls, and photosynthesize too. As far as examples go, you have to know these two protoctists. The first is chlorella, which is similar in structure to a plant cell and can photosynthesize. You can see that they're green, which we know is because of that presence of chlorophyll, that green pigment. The second is amoeba, which you might have looked at in Key Stage 3. They're more like animal cells. You usually find them in pond water, and they consume other organisms to get energy, just like us animals. A common mistake you'll find is when you're asked if protoctists are eukaryotes or prokaryotes, most students find it logical to assume that if they're protoctists, then they're prokaryotic. And in most cases, it's logical, it's somewhat correct. Nearly all of them are unicellular organisms, which is similar to what prokaryotes are. But they do have nuclei, like you can see in the structure diagram, and some of them have a simple multicellular structure. So they're still considered eukaryotic. Just watch out for that. That's all you've got to know in terms of eukaryotes. And now we'll move on to prokaryotes, which as far as your GCSE is concerned are only bacteria, so you can pretty much think of prokaryotes as bacteria. Now, just like protocysts, bacteria are microscopic, and as they're prokaryotes, they're all unicellular, without exceptions, and they do not have a nucleus. They still have DNA stored in their cells, obviously, because they're living organisms, which means they need to reproduce and pass their DNA on, except, unlike in eukaryotes, their DNA is not stored in a membrane-bound nucleus. Instead, they have a circular chromosome of DNA just floating around in the cytoplasm. They also have extra bits of DNA in these little circular loops of DNA that we call plasmids, and they contain some extra genes not included in that DNA chromosome. It's worth mentioning that they don't just have no nucleus, but again, as they're prokaryotes, they have no membrane-bound organelles at all. For example, they wouldn't have a mitochondria either. That's another membrane-bound organelle. They don't have those. Now, they're pretty similar to protocysts in a way that some of them will have chloroplasts and be able to photosynthesize. But most of the bacteria you see will be able to feed off living organisms, just like us animals. Both living and dead, actually. You've probably heard of these bacteria. Some bacteria that decompose dead bodies of animals. That kind of thing. So just make sure you familiarize yourself with this common bacteria structure you see on screen, in case you're asked to label any of these features of it. In terms of examples, you have to learn about Lactobacillus bulgaricus, or just lactobacillus, which is actually the bacteria they use in the process of turning milk into yogurt. The other one you need to know, which we'll talk about more later, is pneumococcus, which can cause pneumonia, a disease. And that's all we need to know for the 5 kingdoms of life. The next part of the video is going to be talking about viruses and pathogens. Starting with viruses. Now, these are actually not living things. They're particles rather than cells, and they're always even smaller than bacteria. They're smaller than any living organism, which is how they can infect any organism, even bacteria. They're just that small. They can enter any cell. Now, the reason they're not considered living is because they don't carry out all A and Mrs. H. Gren life processes for themselves. They need to be inside something called a host cell, basically a cell in another organism that they infect and take over so that they can even reproduce or do any of these other processes. Which is why we consider them parasites, because they rely on another host organism to grow and reproduce and do all of their activities. If they need to be in a living host cell to reproduce and can't reproduce as they are, then they aren't considered able to undergo the process of reproduction or any of the other processes by themselves. So by themselves, as a virus, they aren't considered living organisms. You also have to know that viruses can infect all living organisms, like I said earlier, even bacteria, and that viruses themselves have no cellular structure or even fixed shape. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes, but there's a common structure or a set of common features that you've got to learn for viruses, and it's the one you see on the screen now. Specifically, they have a protein coat that surrounds some genetic material, either a DNA nucleic acid or an RNA nucleic acid. Again, just remember that this is an example of common features that viruses have, a common structure, if you may, and that there's no fixed shape or structure for viruses. That's very important. As far as examples go here, you have to learn a few for the Edexal specification. First, it's the influenza virus, which is what causes the flu or influenza. And then you've got to learn about the tobacco mosaic virus, which is a virus that infects tobacco plants and makes their leaves discolored by stopping them from producing chloroplasts. If they're not producing chloroplasts, then they're also not producing chlorophyll, so they're not producing that green pigment and they're losing their color. That's how they get decolorized. Finally, you also need to know about the HIV virus, which causes a disease called AIDS that you might have heard of. AIDS is a disease that attacks the immune system, and what it does is it stops the immune system from producing the white blood cells that normally fight off infections. Basically, white blood cells are what consume those pathogens or the organisms that cause disease in your body. We look at this in more depth in a later video on how the immune system works, but if your body can't produce these cells, then there's nothing in your body to fight off that infection. And unfortunately, a lot of people that have AIDS will not survive if they get a cold or something like that because their body simply cannot fight it off. They don't have enough white blood cells, they don't have enough resources to fight it off. One last thing you need to learn here is pathogens. Pathogens, which I've just mentioned, are any organisms that cause disease. They include some fungi, some protocysts, and some bacteria. However, importantly, there's an exception to this rule. Viruses are also considered pathogens. Are they living organisms? No, so technically they shouldn't be, but no, they are still considered pathogens. You just have to be aware of this fact and you have to learn it. Viruses are pathogens too. Also, you'll be commonly asked on some specific examples of pathogens that you need to learn. So here they are. The pathogenic protoxis that you need to learn is Plasmodium, and you need to know it because it causes the disease malaria. If it helps you to remember, the protoxis' actual name is Plasmodium malariae, which is also an acceptable answer, obviously, and you can sort of make that link. Malariae, malaria. The pathogenic bacterium you have to learn would be pneumococcus, which we talked about earlier, and it causes pneumonia, a disease called pneumonia. Sorry, there's a bit of a typo there. It's pneumonia with an I before the A. And that's it. I appreciate it's a very long lesson and a large amount of content, but you've now finished the entirety of the first section of the course, so give yourself a nice pat on the back for that. As always, pause the video and check out these summary tables to make sure you're comfortable with all of the keywords, definitions, and examples before you move on. Now it's time to consolidate with some questions testing your understanding of the content and prepare you for the exam technique by trying a few past paper questions after. So have a go at this first question. Pause the video and give it a shot. The correct answer here is B, because fungi are made up of hyphae, those thread-like structures we mentioned before, which contain a lot of nuclei, also like we mentioned earlier. And Protoctis is also correct because Protoctis are mostly unicellular with nuclei and chloroplasts. Remember, only some of these Protoctis will have chloroplasts. It's those Protoctis that are closer to plant cells and photosynthesize to make their food, those autotrophic Protoctists. If they're similar to animal cells like an amoeba, then no, they won't have these chloroplasts or cell wall. Just keep that in mind. Now try this next question. And the answer here is D. Only viruses have a protein coat, and that's one of their common features, a protein coat surrounding a nucleic acid like DNA or RNA. Next, try this question. The correct answer here is A, 1 and 2. It can be the other two because, again, mitochondria are membrane bound and nuclei are membrane bound. They've got membranes around them. And prokaryotic organisms have no membrane bound organelles. They don't have any nuclei, they don't have any mitochondria. Now give this question a go. The correct answer here is A, since W is the nucleus and X is the cell membrane, both organelles you'd find in an animal cell. And finally, try this question. A little more complicated, but give it a try. The correct answer here is C. Looking at the diagram, first we have to find X, which, if we go down the diagram, it's a living organism with a nucleus and a cell wall made of cellulose. So it must be a plant, because they're the ones that have a cell wall made of cellulose. Then we've got to find Y, a living organism with a nucleus, but the cell wall is not made of cellulose. Instead, it must be made of chitin, making it a fungus. And finally, a living organism with no nucleus must be a prokaryote, because they don't have any nuclei or membrane-bound organelles, which is Z. Now we're going to move on to some past paper questions. These are questions I've taken from real Edexcel iGCSE papers, and they're the kind of questions you're likely to be asked about this topic in the exam itself. Try this first question. Pause the video, give it a try. Here is my answer to it, and here is the mark scheme. As you can see, for the first question, which, mind you, is a very, very common question, it's repeated in a lot of papers, so make sure you learn it. You have to prove why a virus isn't considered living. And talk about any two of the Mrs. H. processes you see, like I did, will score you those 2 marks. Any of them work. For the next part, you can name any disease caused by any virus. I chose AIDS, which is caused by the HIV virus. But again, like you see on the mark scheme, anything is accepted as long as it's valid. That's a theme you'll see in Edexcel. Anything is accepted by the examiners as long as it's valid and shows your scientific knowledge. Even the coronavirus will work, yes. For part B, it was more of an application question here. Proteins aren't living, just like viruses, but they don't have any DNA, and they're smaller than the viruses. They have no protein code either. Any of the points you see there in the mark scheme are all valid, so give yourself a mark. Now try this second question. And here is the mark scheme. Quite simple, just ticking the boxes. Viruses have protein coats, the other two don't. Not all bacteria and fungi are pathogens, but all viruses are. And also only fungi will have cell walls made of chitin. The only eukaryotes here are fungi, so they're the only ones whose DNA is stored in a nucleus. And finally, bacteria and fungi are living, so both of them undergo the process of respiration, one of the Mrs. H. processes. Give yourself a mark out of 4 for this one. Next, pause the video and have a go at this question. Here's how I answered it. For part A, I gave examples from the list they've given us. For part B, I stated a few valid differences. And for part II of B, I chose to talk about the tobacco mosaic virus and what it does to tobacco plants. Looking at the mark scheme, they chose to talk about HIV instead. But again, any disease and any virus associated with it works, as long as it's caused by a virus like the question asks. Don't talk about any other diseases caused by other pathogens. The question clearly states caused by a virus. So for the first part of B, you could have also wrote any of those valid reasons. Really, it's just a test of your knowledge here. Anything else valid will get the mark. So give yourself a mark. Now try this question. And here is the mark scheme. Now any of these points could work, and there's one I actually haven't mentioned in this video, which is the presence of a flagellum in some bacteria. Now flagella are just tails, sort of. You see them in sperm cells, and if you remember the diagram of the Protoctus we had earlier, the diagram of that amoeba, they also have a flagellum. That little tail they had on the end of it is a flagellum. I chose not to mention it because it's not always the case, but it's definitely something you can mention too, and it's accepted by the mark scheme here. Now I'll give this question a go. Here's how I answered it. With a valid example for an animal, yes, it can be anything even as wild as a dolphin. They accept it all. You could say a starfish for all they care. They'll still give you the mark. And for the other three, I just gave examples that you had to learn. In terms of the table, I just filled it out according to the properties of the different groups. Here's what the mark scheme looks like for it. Make sure to correct your answers. Oh, whoops, sorry. Looks like the first two sections on section B are actually missing in that photo, but they're just the same as how I solved the question, so just correct using that. Some and none. Moving on now to this question. Pause the video and give it a shot. And here is how I answered it. We know animals don't have chloroplasts and can't photosynthesize. Both are multicellular. Animals don't have cell walls, but they do store carbohydrates as glycogen, as opposed to plants who store it as starch or sucrose. In terms of groups, could have been any of the three, like you see on the mark scheme right here. Take a moment to correct your answers and give yourself a score. Final question now, give it a try. And here's how I answered it. Remember, the key part here is that fungi also store carbohydrates as glycogen. It's not just animals, fungi do it too. And here's the mark scheme. Mark your answers and give yourself a score. And in total now, look at all the things you got wrong, or if you didn't get wrong, good job. And correct yourself. See where you went wrong, maybe rewatch the video, clarify those concepts with yourself. And with that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you found this video useful, drop a like, subscribe, and share to support the channel and help more students. For more lessons, check out my iGCSE Edexcel Biology playlist, and feel free to comment down below or reach out by email if you have any questions. That's all for this lesson. Have a nice day.